Good morning and welcome to our webinar this morning, Farming Through COVID-19, Managing Labor and Employee Issues During the Pandemic. Appreciate everybody coming in this morning. We've got a great group of participants here and a great panel. First of all, happy Ag Day and happy Ag Week. March 24th was Ag Day. This is Ag Week, and we're continuing to celebrate all the things that agriculture does, and even during these times. And that celebration and sort of the things that we're having to work through speak pretty loudly about the webinar that we're going to have today, that we are farming in different conditions this year. And this webinar came out of a number of stories and columns that we've been putting up on the DTN and DTN PF products to address some of the issues that farmers are having to deal with and agribusinesses are dealing with as they think about getting the work done this spring, whether that's spring planting, whether that's other field work, whether that's spring calving. We're all going to be dealing with our employees a little bit differently than we have in the past. We've got a great team of panelists this morning to talk about that. First up, Lori Culler, who's the founder and the owner of Ag Hires, which is an agriculture recruiting and employee management firm. Lori comes to us with a long experience of working in the employee management and recruitment field for a lot of companies, Fortune 500 companies and others. Lori is also our DTN's HR coach columnist, so she writes a column for us every month on some of these employee issues. The most important thing for us at DTN is she also comes to us with a vast experience because her family farms. So not only does she know the rules, but she also knows how those rules actually work in the real world. Next, we'll hear from DTN's own ag policy editor, Chris Clayton. Chris is constantly following the ins and outs of ag policy, and that includes issues like H-2A, and some of the visa requirements and some of the changes that are happening in response to the COVID-19 issue. So Chris will speak to us with a little bit about what the current situation is and what some of the rules are and how those rules might change as time goes on. Chris knows the personalities that are part of making these rules happen as he covers things in Washington, D.C., and so he'll be explaining those as well. With that, Lori, I would hand it over to you. And so tell us about some of the things that you've been up to and some of the things that you're hearing and seeing as to how employers are handling these issues.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thanks, Greg. And good morning, everyone. Today, we really want to kind of hone in on what are some of these best practices that we can implement on our farms to really lower our risk of exposure to the coronavirus and really make sure we're healthy during planting season. We also sent a survey out recently to farms and agribusinesses, and we'd like to share what they're doing on their own operations to improve their practices and what changes they've made, and as well as talk about how to handle ill or potentially ill employees, and then hopefully kind of wrap up with how to kind of capitalize on the labor market during these times. Just to give you kind of share my perspective, I'm calling you in from Michigan. So we farm in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. And in Michigan, we had, in terms of cases, this past Thursday we had 300, and as of Tuesday we had 2,300 cases of COVID-19 and 43 deaths. So if you're in a state where you only have a couple hundred, you know, we were kind of there just 5 days ago. So what we're hearing is really a vast difference of opinions, not only from farm to farm, but even within farms, from employee to employees or one generation to another, on their view of the threats of the virus. So we have kind of the extremes on both ends. But what we can't have on our farms is really some employees being extra cautious and really taking precaution and very concerned, and other employees being not concerned and very kind of careless maybe with their behavior. And without addressing some ground rules, it can really lead to just high frustration and discontent amongst the team members. So what we don't want is this to cause, kind of some grumblings and some cultural issues amongst our team by just kind of not setting some clear ground rules. So how do we establish those ground rules of working together? And hopefully today you can walk away with some new standards, some ideas that maybe you can implement on your farm. And then, how do we kind of post it, talk about it, and make sure that we kind of solidify it going forward and hold each other accountable. So thinking about new ways to communicate daily, how do we limit interaction between one another? We've all heard the 6-foot rule and guidance that we're trying to abide by, and limiting those outside interactions with vendors and visitors that just are not necessary. Then how do we protect that older generation on our farms? So if we look at, who we've kind of surveyed and polled, about 70% have already implemented policy changes on their farms and agribusinesses due to COVID-19. So think about on your farm, daily communication. So could the morning meeting change to a group text message, or even a group text message at the end of the night? Where did everyone finish up for the day in terms of planting acres, or what their focus is the next day? So building those group discussions on Facebook or group text messages together. If you're a larger organization, using those online video discussions through Zoom, especially if you have some employees that are working from home, to keep everyone connected. And thinking about, limiting that interaction with truck drivers that are coming in and out, have them not come out of their vehicles, have them pass the paperwork through the window. We had several farms mention they're going to stagger lunch times, so no longer be kind of eating at the same break room together, working at the same time together. Obviously people not bringing in, kind of lunches from outside, like family members with their kids that we used to appreciate, maybe last year during planting season, kind of encouraging that not to happen this season. When it's possible, could we assign a truck or a tractor to one person, and drive separately to fields, instead of everyone kind of jumping in and out of each other's tractors as best we can. And when possible, we've got several farms and agribusinesses, keeping shop doors open, keeping windows open. We've heard a lot about, the kind of like the shared air is an issue. So how do we kind of keep that fresh air kind of going throughout our farms? And limiting, who's going out to obtain parts. What parts could just be ordered or be dropped off to you? Do we have to go to the store? And if so, do we designate one person so we're just not, the entire team's not out and about at different places interacting with others? And then, how do we limit just any visitors and vendors that we may have kind of been acceptable for them to be on the farm, and now we're really asking them to kind of not be on the farm, or to drop the package off at the porch and not come in and post that policy if you have a new policy of how you want those parts delivered, or where you want those parts kind of set out for your farm. Thinking about like sanitation and hygiene practices and policies, we've obviously heard about the good practices about washing hands and wiping things down, but what does that mean for us on our farm, right? We've got lots going on, lots of moving parts. So thinking about keeping the Clorox wipes in the tractors and the trucks, and having that kind of rule: wipe down your steering wheel, wipe down your kind of door handle on your door, and wipe down the monitor, the screens in the tractors, before you leave, and then just leave that kind of Clorox wipe ready in there for the next person. We've got lots of people washing down commonly used areas. We had one farm say they wash down the door handles 4 times a day. We have others that are basically adhering to a complete daily wipe down of everything in the office, from break rooms to door handles to kind of the main office area. And setting some expectations on what we want from the employees in terms of, hand washing and having extra hand washing stations, offering, if they want, that personal protective equipment such as gloves, and having those disposable gloves basically available for them if they want it. Not having that community refrigerator, bring in their own food and not kind of share it all in one place. and even extending that on beyond, how the employees are behaving outside of the farm. You can't fully control that, but we can definitely encourage it. So can they order in groceries, where you can just kind of drive up and pick up the groceries instead of going in, encouraging them to please limit their going to other businesses, interacting with other families if it's not necessary. Could they limit their interaction at home so that that employee stays healthy, so that the farm stays healthy? And then thinking about how do we, I don't want to say quarantine our older generation, but how do we keep them safe? So we had, one of our surveyed farms say that they're basically kind of limiting their dad to the shop and the house. So they can go there and we'll bring you everything you need, but we want to keep you safe. So thinking about what are those practices we want for the older generation. And then kind of moving into, how should we be handling and can we handle, sick or potentially sick employees? So taking temperatures of your employees, you can take their daily temp. It is actually legal, right now to be doing that. And if you feel they have a temp and you want to send them home, that's perfectly okay. Same thing with if someone you feel you think is sick, if someone is coughing too much and you think they should go home. Actually, I just heard from one of my employees, her husband was sent home because they thought he looked too tired. I guess that's on there. But if you feel they're potentially sick, you have the right as an employer to send them home. So you would pay them up until the time that they leave, and then we'll talk about the Emergency Sick Act, but we would also pay for the first 80 days then after that, or 80 hours after that. So encouraging your team to speak up if they're feeling ill. Typically when it's planting season or harvest season, it's go time. And on our farm, we're typically asking people, if you can muster through it, let's try to get through the day, if they have the sniffles or what have you. So just changing up our tone and behavior on illness on the farm. So yes, if you are feeling sick, please, stay home. Please don't come in. Or if you're starting to feel sick the middle of the day, let us know. Go home. We're going to encourage it. And just changing that kind of cultural kind of behavior around that. One thing, though, if someone does fall ill, the first thing you're going to want to do is, get them to go home. But take that kind of 20 seconds to understand who they've been interacting with throughout the day, what equipment have they been touching, what equipment have they been in contact with, and just kind of gather the information so you know what to wipe down, what rooms or tractors or equipment to extra sanitize and air out to protect the others, and making sure that person's wearing protective gear that is cleaning those areas. And then, on if you have 3 to 5 employees, obviously we're all going to know who went home. But if you have a larger operation, legally you're not supposed to be sharing the employee's name. So, think about when it's not necessary to share who went home or why, or if someone has the coronavirus on the team, then I would encourage you to not share that with others. There's a kind of emergency paid leave sick act that came out that has been in approval. So even if you have never had a sick time policy, or how you feel about sick time policy, it is now required during this time now through December 31st of 2020. So if an employee is sick from COVID-19 or looks to potentially be sick or is self-quarantining or is caring for someone that is quarantining or self-quarantining, you are required to have paid sick time of up to 80 hours for the employees. If you have part-timers, it's adjusted based on the part-time hours. So if you had an employee with working 20 hours a week, then you have 40 hours of this paid sick leave. It is reimbursable by the government, so it would be reimbursed on your payroll tax as a credit. And it really applies to everyone that has 500 employees or under. There is actually a exception, if you saw it on there, if you've been reading about it, like an exemption potentially if you have 50 employees or less, but you'd have to prove really that it had jeopardized the viability of your business. So I think that would be, it's in there, but I think it'd be hard to kind of prove that paying 2 weeks of paid time off is, jeopardizing the viability of your business. So if that's the case, there could be some exemptions, but I think it's going to be pretty difficult to receive those exemptions. So I would err on the cautious side and pay your sick leave kind of as advised here. Switching gears really to, how do we capitalize on this market a little bit as an opportunity? So what are some positives that are coming out of this? We've been extremely tight on our labor market for the past several years and across all industries, obviously including ours as well. But with the layoffs of other industries, how do we attract employees on our farm? Potentially that is for seasonal employees looking, to potentially maybe work full-time, or they're seasonal and maybe they're going to be future part-time employees that are your evening relief, for your tractor operators to give them a break. So we kind of love that seasonal part-time labor to round out our team on our farm. So using this time to really attract some other industries. So using social media and word of mouth, and we've got some packages at Ag Hires that target these types of employees and how to attract them to your farm. There is, a little bit of what has been recently passed with what the government will provide on top of their unemployment benefits that might, encourage people to not work, right, if they want to, but there's still going to be those individuals that want to work, that want to be contributing and are going to look for opportunities. And this might be just the right time for you to attract some people outside of ag into ag that would be great employees for the long haul. So think about ways you can use that and capitalize on that. And the last kind of point here is really what this will, kind of how you handle the situation, how it will impact your work culture. So, how you handle the situation really does say something to your employees about your farm and how they're valued and your beliefs. And so how can we best support employees and their families during this time? So offering some flexibility, if the administrative staff could work from home, how can we get them set up to do that, especially if they have families, being that resource to your team for regular updates, sharing that in news with them. We are kind of leaving an impression on our team members one way or the other on how we're handling the situation. So, think about that impression that you're leaving, and is that building up your culture and how that's affecting you? Because I think this is a great way to showcase what we typically do in ag, right, is that we're family-owned companies that care for our employees, and we're going to be flexible, we're going to be here, and we're going to be in this together. So kind of showcasing that and understanding your decisions and your communication, how that impacts your work culture and how your employees feel. We do have a few resources on here, as this will be published afterwards for your guidance as well. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Chris for him to go over really policies and H2A.
And he has a lot of H2A workers as well. But, his situation, he had not his farm, but his town had one person who was ill, went to their local clinic, was positive for COVID-19, and they basically ended up having to shut down the clinic now for 2 weeks. So perhaps before, if somebody's even showing symptoms, call the clinic or your local hospital, see if you can do something through telemedicine or over the phone and visit with them before just having somebody go directly to a clinic or hospital, because if you don't have access to easy testing in your area, you could end up shutting down your local health provider and affect health care for a lot of different people immediately. So think about using the phone and reaching out to your healthcare provider ahead of time. And let's see, can I switch this forward? Maybe I can. Oh, there we go. Just some of the details from last week and what we understood was going on with H-2A workers. At first, the State Department announced they were basically shutting down all visa applications, and this is a peak time of year for these H-2A workers coming in. It really begins to hit in the second or third fiscal quarter for the government, which translates into spring and summer for the rest of us. But if you've been waiting on applications and stuff like that, and wait to get your workers a little later in the year, this is where the problems may arise for you. At first, the State Department said they were shutting down all visa applications, and then after pushback from some of the ag groups of the Mexican consulates, particularly in Monterrey, said they would continue processing H-2A visas from returning workers from Mexico, which means they've already gone through most of the process in the past. They don't have to conduct interviews, so they don't need that face-to-face time with somebody at the consulate before they get their visa application approved. And those are the ones that they're just signing off on and will allow back through. And from what we understand, that takes care of about 90% of last year's workers, potentially, assuming they would all be coming back, that sort of thing. It's a little more unclear about the consulates outside of Mexico, where you get about 27,000 workers. South Africa is one of the countries I mentioned, but you've also got Jamaica, you've got Guatemala, and a few other countries that send in a lot of workers. South Africa, for instance, said it was shutting down all visas until May 31st. Now, it may have been a problem anyway, because we understand also the flight situation for getting from some of these countries is also basically shut down. So besides getting the visa situation taken care of, just simply getting into the United States right now from a country like South Africa might be difficult just because of logistics just aren't working out. But nonetheless, you're talking about potentially 27,000 of these workers who might not be able to make it in because they're not coming directly from Mexico. State Department is going to be trying to review policies for potentially new workers. Is there a way that they can, do something over video or some other way to possibly allow these visa applications to continue? Because we use about 10 to 15% more H-2A workers every single year. So if we were at 257,000 last year was the number, then we would be looking at, there were probably enough applications to go to 250 to 260, or 260, 270, 280,000 workers that farmers were asking for. So even if they're allowing everybody in from last year, that's probably still a shortage of what everybody was asking for. And the situation is fluid. We know, for instance, Canada is now saying everybody coming in who is not just a farm worker, but a short-term worker under their visa programs now has to go through a 2-week quarantine. We haven't heard that specifically in the United States, but certain states are also setting up their own different individual quarantine situations. And I think depending on where somebody is coming in at the border guards may have a little bit different information or understanding of what the situation is than someplace else. And that may complicate getting these workers into the country as well. So A lot is happening in terms of trying to get H-2A workers into the country, and I think that, we're going to continue to hear about complications, even if they're coming from Mexico and returning workers. States may demand that they be tested ahead of time, and you may even hear situations about quarantines. There was some work done with USDA and the Labor Department last week, knowing there were about 20,000 H-2A and H-2B workers already in the country that had their contracts, their 9 months were expiring here relatively soon. And USDA and Department of Labor made a deal to say, we will allow those contracts to be extended and they can go on and work for somebody potentially different. The USDA did put up a website as well to link into that under their farmers.gov website to check for information. So each state will have its own different, protocols for how they allow those workers in. And you're also seeing a lot more push from groups like the United Farm Workers, as Lori was mentioning, protective gear. The farm workers who use a lot of pesticides, spraying, for instance, use a lot of protective gear. There's now some concerns from those workers that their protective gear may end up there may be a shortage of that sort of situation. So that's something to think about and consider if you have workers who have pesticide applications. There may be a challenge getting that protective gear because we know every hospital in the country that has COVID-19 patients has been scrambling for gear as well. So that's pretty much what I understand. Just elaborating a little bit on that situation with unemployment briefly, though. It's in that Senate bill that passed last night. The House still has to pass it to make it law. But what that will do is if your state, for instance, offers $300 a week in unemployment benefits, the federal government will add another $600 in unemployment benefits per week for workers up until July 31st. And they've also broadened it out so that people who are self-employed, the quote gig economy people, the Uber drivers, others, but any self-employed person as well that suddenly finds himself without a contract, without work or whatever, might also be eligible for these unemployment benefits. Not sure exactly how that's going to work in the application process or whatever, but at least what we understand, and going until July 31st, you might see some more, there might be difficulties getting labor because the unemployment benefits might be more than they would receive actually going out and finding work at the moment. That's all I have at the moment, and I guess we'll be able to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Lori. I want to remind everybody you can type questions in, and we'll queue those up as they come in. Several people have asked about getting access to the slides and things, and this is being recorded, and we'll be making those available so you can pull those down. We usually get that done fairly quickly. It takes a little bit of mechanical time to get that posted, but we'll be sending out information on all that. Chris, the question about quarantining and what Canada is doing probably brings up an issue. Probably the implied thing there is if you think you need workers from outside the country, getting them in now, sooner better than later is probably a good idea.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly how the paperwork is on that because we've long before all of this occurred, there's been a challenge of getting workers in a timely fashion through the Department of Labor process. We've had farm groups over the last few years talk about how the H-2A process is broken, the paperwork doesn't get processed, the workers don't come in time. Lori may know a great deal more about that than myself, but I don't know if the process will allow you to bring in workers ahead of your normal schedule. And Lori, you might be able to elaborate a little bit more on that.
You know, I don't believe they can either, and I'm not a full H2A expert, but you have those set contracts in place which are very in-depth with exact kind of times of arrival and how many employees and what that looks like. So I don't know if you're able to speed up that process.
Related to that, Lori, in terms of quarantining, both what would you recommend and what's legal if I've got employees coming onto the farm that I've not had before, either because they're coming through a visa process outside the country, or maybe even there, as you were talking about earlier, there's someone that has been laid off from a job that they were doing off agriculture, and I'm bringing them in. What's the guidance on, before you bring them into the farm, into your team, making sure that they're either, quarantined for 14 days, or what other kinds of processes would you recommend before you bring a new team member in?
That's a good question. So it almost also goes back to the emergency of the farm, right? Like how close we are to plant and needing that person. But, I think if they don't have symptoms and they've stayed relatively close to your area, right? Like they're not traveling from New York or some of those hotbeds. I don't know necessarily if I would quarantine them before they start. But like legally, I guess you could, right, delay their 14 days and have them start after. But I think as long as we've got some open communication on where they've kind of been and what that looks like and you're feeling comfortable with it, I think it'd be okay for them to start.
Good point. And you mentioned communication. That's another question that comes in is, you talk about communication. You talked a little bit about that consistency with all the employees. What are some of the things that help us, as managers, maintain that consistency? Does writing those things down and just the process of putting them on paper and handing them out, is that one of the big helps? How do we keep that consistency going so that we don't, because human nature is, you try to treat all your employees the same, but you sometimes in the heat of the moment can vacillate between more extreme areas. So what helps us keep that consistency?
Right, that's good. I think, one is really kind of agreeing on those, and I do believe in posting them up and kind of constant reminders. I think when you have it really on paper, posted in the break room, posted in the front door and you walk in, posted in your shop, I think that says something. And if you add something, update it, repost it, and share it. And again, it's just more of like that visual kind of constant reminder that this is what's important and this is what we're looking to follow. And then, sending out that kind of group text or group reminder, hey, I've noticed this, we really want to limit that, and just that kind of constant, kind of push for it throughout from the management team. That's really what's going to change the behavior. If you have the discussion and people start kind of being loose with it, and then no one says anything, then all of a sudden it doesn't really matter, and we're going to get even looser. So really kind of sticking to what we agreed upon, posting it everywhere, sending gentle reminders, pushing as management team on always focusing on that. And it is inconvenient. I'm not, some of the stuff it's inconvenient. So we're always in a hurry on the farms, and we're just going to want to go. But, again, maintaining that consistency is going to be really important.
Questions come in about housing. Any recommendations that you got from either your survey that you did or what you guys do in your operation in terms of maintaining sanitation in the housing for H2A workers or for other temporary workers?
Mm-hmm. So we are having outside individuals clean the houses. So, again, maybe not just relying on the employees to self-clean, just to make sure that it is thoroughly cleaned. They have kind of rules that they're to follow on keeping it clean, and then we have outside individuals come in and clean the whole place.
Great. Let's see, I got a question here. Rumor is that Canada has incoming workers that that are positive and are quarantined, where do we quarantine those workers, and how do we keep them away from others, I guess is the question. If you had a worker on your farm, what's the suggestion and what to do with that person, other than obviously getting them to the doctor? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge, but you're going to have them quarantined and then quarantined separate from everyone else. And if they are an H2A employee, and you typically have several people like living in a house or an apartment right together, that's going to be a challenge because you have to physically have them quarantined where they're not in interaction with the other employees. And that might entail, getting other housing or putting them in a house by themselves, or getting apartment or something temporary just for them. So I would say that logistically it makes it a little challenging because of the group housing situation, but you're going to have to quarantine them by themselves for those 14 days away from everybody else. And then I would also suggest, who's their point of contact when they are here? Who's going to get their groceries for them? Who's going to be that individual that's going to, bring them what they need, especially if they're H2A and they're outside of the country and they're here and they're being quarantined. That becomes a little bit more of a challenge in getting that fully assigned to someone to handle.
Just to chime in, also consider if they're sick, they're quarantined, but they're also going to probably, just like any other individual that's sick, they're going to be using the restroom more frequently. So somebody's also going to have to be going in there, following up every time 6 individuals are using, particularly if it's a shared restroom, and having to clean up after them as well. Just anything that they've touched is the same kind of situation to keep the spread down.
Really good point. Really good point. A question, Lori, and another one for you. In terms of recruiting, you mentioned that this could be a good time to take advantage of the situation of some folks out there. What kind of tips do you have that a farm can separate itself from the crowd and get people's attention? You mentioned social media. What else would you recommend?
I think there's a couple ways because they're not always maybe going to think of us first, right? So I would love to say, hey, let's get it only on Ag Hires' website, but they might not be coming to the farming website. So really kind of showcasing, we've done a couple things. One is using those paid targeted social media ads. We've also even developed, quick, less than a minute video ads on your farm. And those are more like still pictures with information about your farm and what you have to offer. What we're seeing is a lot of general labor jobs, right? You saw Domino's hiring at 10,000. You saw Amazon hiring 100,000. But those aren't skilled labor positions. We have operator needs. We have mechanic needs. We have, ops managers and field lead positions available. And, in our area, all the road construction companies are shut down as well. They just did that as of last week. So you have all those operators and mechanics available. So I would say doing the video ads, doing social media. You can definitely call us to help you work on that. Making sure on your own personal Facebook page, if you don't have one, create one, or have one of the younger generation in your family, go ahead and create one of those Facebook ads. Because we have something, I still say this all the time, we have something everybody wants. Everybody's looking for that right culture to work for. They want to work with and know the owners. They want to be valued and see their work. Farms have what basically the workforce has been begging for the past several years, and it's been top of their list. We have that. So it's a matter of kind of showcasing that, bragging about that, and then, really having them join our team, even on a temporary basis, to test it out, and it might turn out to be a great long-term fit. My husband technically joined our farm after he came back from Iraq just for a season because he knew my dad, and then 16 years later, right, military turned farmer, has stayed and loved it. So these are some stories, we should capture the attention of these great talented individuals into ag.
That's an excellent story. Chris, a legal question or a foreign policy question. The question is, where can I find info that confirms that the Monterey Consulate is in fact processing H-2A visas? Where would you send folks to keep track of that?
That's a great question. I guess I would probably be trying to reach out to the State Department itself and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I don't know what the situation is with the with actual staffing at the Monterey Consulate at the moment to reach out to them directly. But that may be a possibility in terms of searching and seeing if there's an email contact or somebody there as well. But that was the commitment that they made, really right after the State Department made that announcement that they were going to be shutting off almost all visas. The Monterey Consulate stepped in and said, we will continue to process visas for returning H-2A workers. So, staff or somebody there recognized immediately that that was going to be a situation. So, if you take it for their word, they're still doing that. The big issue that they had was really shutting down the actual face-to-face interviews that visa applicants need, and they said since they were returning workers, they did not need that face-to-face interview.
Good, appreciate that. Question, probably for Lori, but maybe for both of you. This is on the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. Lori, you talked a little bit about that there is this new reimbursement. The question is, does that follow the same rule as the FMLA law does? And that has to do with if you have 50 or more employees within a certain radius. So the example that this questioner asks is, if I have 4 locations with 20 employees separated by 100 miles, does that act still apply to all of my locations, to my organization in total?
Oh, that's a good question. They're separate locations.
Yes.
I have to think about that because it's usually 50 employees within 75 miles, right, for FMLA. And so, but if they're separate, they would still have to follow this because it's under 500 employees for the new Emergency Paid Leave Sick Act. So, if they've got 500 or less, then all of them would have to kind of follow the Emergency Paid Leave Sick Act.
Good, appreciate that. Looking through here to see if we've got, let's see, any word on how visa holders will be handled if they expire while everything is shut down? I think the current standing is they were extending folks that are on visa contracts right now, but any thoughts, Chris, as to where that will go into the future if we continue to have people whose contracts are going to be expiring, but yet we're still kind of under this lockdown situation?
Well, I think USDA and Department of Labor are doing everything they can to extend that. Now, it depends on, the worker themselves, has the option. I'm going to go back home, or I feel free. I can go ahead and extend and work someplace else. But that's what they did with the these 20,000 workers. And somebody you mentioned that the very early question about getting workers ahead of time. Again, here's this pool of 20,000 people with expiring contracts. If you feel like you want to ensure that you can get workers immediately, that's the pool I would be trying to tap into right now. So I suspect as this continues on into the summer months, and as we see a lag in maybe the numbers of people who are coming in, because you keep in mind, some of these visa holders, their family members may not want them to come in and risk being exposed themselves. So that may also limit, returning visa holders a little bit as well. But as this goes on, I suspect the Department of Labor and USDA will continue to find ways to try to allow people to extend contracts. We've been fighting this argument in the United States for several years of trying to get it so that H-2A and visas can go beyond 9 months. Last year there was legislation to try to get it up to 3 years. And actually, I think maybe in Congress you might eventually this spring see this kind of situation happen as we recognize the need for workers, that this might be the one thing that farm groups and other businesses push for, is finally finding a way to modify and change the rules that we've been living under with these guest worker programs.
Good input. Lori, we've talked a lot on this about the workers and about how to deal with the workers. But how about the managers out there? How about the people that are on this line that are dealing with coming up with all the things that we've been suggesting right now? What's your advice to them to make sure that they're taking care of themselves and making sure that they're going to be able to provide the leadership that they need to provide on as we get ready for spring planting?
Mm-hmm. That's a great idea, because I think a lot of times we are thinking about how to care for the employees and how to do these things right, and yet maybe we're the most guilty of being a little loose with ourselves. So thinking about the fact that it's critical to care for yourself and your family during this time frame, because what if you were the one that contracted? What would that look like? So as a leader, it kind of all comes from you on kind of how we're going to tackle planting and how we're going to get through this. So kind of making sure, even I hate to say this, but even your own family, like hopefully they're not going out and about too much, right? So they're limiting the risk when you come home as well, and then you're being cautious with yourself. So really including your whole entire family in trying to reduce any type of exposure would be number one. So talking with the other family members within the farm to agree upon that, but then also going home and talking about amongst all the families on how we're going to behave together as families to really reduce any type of exposure. So one, we're not bringing it to ourselves, we're not bringing it to our employees as well.
Great. Yeah, we have to set examples. Everybody kind of follows the examples that we set, right?
Exactly.
On that regard, a lot of operations that we know of, if you're an employee on that operation, your whole family is involved, and to some extent, some farmers are providing, permanent housing for full-time employees, and the families are all part of that. Do you see either your customers or some of the folks that you talk to in your surveys getting those families involved and reaching out? Again, that communication issue, does that extend to the families of employees as well?
I didn't hear that on the survey, but I would think a great practice, really to extend it. If we don't have kind of families on board with, some of these best practices, then that puts the employees at risk at home, and then potentially bringing it to the farm and then sharing it with everyone. So, maybe putting a newsletter together, to share with all the families, kind of what we're encouraging, kind of the why we're encouraging this, and how we'd like to work together, or, again, encouraging maybe to pick up the groceries instead of going in and things like that. I think that would be great. I think kind of encouraging that, extending that out to those families, and including them in part of the process. No one had mentioned that, but I think it's critical to extend it to the next step out.
So this could be a time where we implement some of those things that maybe we wanted to do but haven't done in the past, and we actually get started on some of those communications. That sounds like a great tip. Absolutely. We're drawing down on questions, and I'd give we've still got a few more moments yet. If anybody has a question or something that we maybe didn't could clarify to your needs, fire those in. In the meantime, Chris, obviously we're tracking the movement of the bill that's going through as fast as we can. What's your prognostication on us having the CARE bill through and signed by the end of the week, you think?
Yeah, the House will be called back tomorrow morning to vote on this, and given the way House handles debates, they'll have a vote by the end of the day at some point. It's a question of how many people want to fight about it, get their 2 cents in on a floor statement or something like that. But they'll have a vote by the end of the day. It was impressive that even as they were fighting about this issue with the unemployment insurance at the end of last night, it was a 96-0 vote. That's it's just amazing that you didn't see somebody protest in some way or another in the Senate and say, I'm not voting for this. So that sends a clear message to the House that, this is the big issue is, not allowing the House members to go ahead and offer changes, because the Senate has now walked out and said, we're not coming back until April 20th. That was what Majority Leader McConnell set last night after they voted. So the House has got to go in tomorrow, recognize this bill is what it is, and vote on it. So I suspect that it'll go into play. Now, they were talking a lot of questions with Treasury Secretary Mnuchin about how long it'll take these $1,200 checks to come out to everybody. And, they were talking potentially 3 weeks. So they're probably already trying to figure out the mechanism to start that to happen. But, would not be surprising if you see President Trump signing that bill as early as Saturday.
Excellent. Appreciate that. Let's see, we got a question coming in. This will be one of the last ones. Thinking in terms of employees and leave requirements with school closings or child care unavailability, what kind of recommendations do you make, Lori, in terms of keeping things going on the farm while you have to let some employees be home because they've got kids to take care of if they can't get child care? How do you balance out keeping the farm going but also making sure the kids are getting cared for on the employees' homes?
Right. It's a challenge, because especially, your office team or just anyone right across the farm, or we've got some great individuals on our farm who are management level, right, who are female and have kids. So it can be a challenge, but trying to be, I would say, flexible in terms of whatever they can do at home, allowing them to do that. So if they can do any laptop or work at home, making those exceptions to do that. And I think thinking on a farm, if they're in a role that can't do that with a laptop, still probably being, flexible and allowing them to work from home. Again, I know it's a strain on the business, but, with the policies in place of staying at home and not, it's really difficult for them to get that coverage for their children. So being as flexible as possible, even on our own team, obviously we're all remote now, but they're literally allowed to work whatever hours they want. So if that's in the evening when their husband's home, or if that's, vice versa, and during the day, whatever that kind of looks like, having that flexibility as the employer as best you can is important. And if they're not set up, how can we get them set up to do some of that work at home? Again, on a farm, we can't always do everything at home. Administrative side, we can do an awful lot, from home.
Great, appreciate that. Well, wrap it up here. I want to thank both Lori and Chris for taking the time today. Chris is pulled away from his duties of watching things that are going on in Washington, which has become an even more difficult chore right now with us all working from home. And Lori, I appreciate you taking the time to share with us. I want to remind everybody that we'll have a version of this up available for download and re-download to share with your other team members if you want to. I also want to remind, as we've been talking, you've seen on your screen, we've got an extended webinar coming up next Tuesday at noon. Tuesday is the USDA Planning Intentions Report, and we always do a review of those reports via webinar. And we're going to extend that a little bit next week to Todd Holtman, our lead analyst, will do his typical review of that planning intentions report and what it means to the world in terms of commodity prices and exports and things. And then we'll extend that to, we're going to bring in our DTN livestock analyst, Shaylee Stewart, and Bryce Anderson, our senior ag meteorologist, and we'll have a time for some questions and some comments about just what's the market look like currently and for the next couple of weeks, specifically with the coronavirus issue going on. So we've been addressing that in our daily commentary and news stories and things on the DTN platforms, but this will be a chance to ask some of our experts what are they seeing, what are they hearing that's specific to the coronavirus situation, which is beginning to affect a lot of areas in agriculture, particularly some of the livestock side of things. So we'll be glad to have those people on. So please join us for that. That starts at noon Central on Tuesday, March 31st. We'll have updates of all that. And, of course, we'll have an immediate response to the U.S. Planning Intentions Report. That comes down at 11 o'clock Central on Tuesday, and we'll start posting stories on to respond to that and how the market's responding to that report as quickly as we can in the minutes following that 11 o'clock announcement. So, again, I want to thank everybody for participating in this. Strange times take and unusual times take some unusual answers to keep things going on the farm. I want to wish everybody a safe season as we get out there. Take care of yourselves. Wash your hands. Remember that we'll get through this season. We may have to work a few extra hours, but don't let that get to be a chore and put anybody in danger. So have a great rest of National Ag Week, and thanks so much for participating.